The late September sun hung low over the rolling hills of western Kentucky, casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts that marked the boundaries of Caleb Morrison's struggling farm. At 43 years old, Caleb had the kind of worn hands and sun-creased face that told the story of a man who'd spent his entire life working land that barely yielded enough to keep him afloat. His family's farm, once a modest but reliable operation that his grandfather had built in the 1950s, had been slowly bleeding money for the past 5 years, ever since the agricultural equipment loan he'd taken out had gone sideways when corn prices dropped and stayed down. The October mortgage payment loomed just 3 weeks away, and Caleb knew he was short again. The small herd of cattle he maintained brought in some income, but not enough. He'd been selling off equipment piece by piece, watching his operation shrink year after year, trying to hold on to the land his family had worked for 3 generations. His wife Sarah had left 2 years ago, tired of the financial stress and the isolation of rural life, taking their daughter Emma with her to Louisville. Now it was just Caleb, his aging border collie Rex, and 200 acres of Kentucky bluegrass that seemed to demand more than they could ever give back. That Tuesday morning, Caleb drove his battered 1998 Ford F-150 to the county livestock auction in Harrodsburg, not because he had money to spend, but because sometimes desperate men went looking for desperate solutions. The truck's check engine light had been on for 6 months, and the passenger side door only opened from the outside, but it ran, and that was all that mattered. The auction barn smelled of hay, manure, and the anxious sweat of animals being sold, a scent Caleb had known his entire life. He walked through the holding pens with his hands in the pockets of his worn Carhartt jacket, watching farmers and ranchers inspect cattle, horses, and livestock of every description. Most of the animals looked healthy enough, prime stock from farms that were upgrading or simply cycling through their herds. But in the back corner, away from the main action, Caleb noticed a horse standing alone in a small pen, largely ignored by the crowd. The animal was a gelding, probably 8 or 9 years old based on his teeth, standing about 15 hands high. His coat was a dull bay color, matted and dirty, stretched tight over ribs that showed too clearly beneath. His mane was tangled, his hooves overgrown and cracked. But it was the horse's eyes that caught Caleb's attention, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a depth of awareness unusual for an animal in such poor condition. The horse stood perfectly still, not with the resignation of a broken animal, but with a strange, watchful patience. "That one ain't worth the hay you'd feed him," came a voice beside Caleb. He turned to see Ezra Patterson, a neighboring farmer whose land adjoined Caleb's property to the north. Ezra was in his 60s, a lifelong horseman who'd raised quarter horses before age, and economics forced him to scale back. Been standing there all morning. Nobody's even bid on him. "What's his story?" Caleb asked, studying the horse more carefully. Despite the animal's poor condition, there was something about his conformation, the way he stood, the shape of his neck and shoulders, that suggested he'd been something more than a neglected backyard horse. "Came in from a farm liquidation down in Tennessee. Owner died, no family wanted to deal with it, everything got auctioned off. This one's been passed over at 3 auctions already." Ezra shook his head. "Probably end up going to the kill buyers if nobody takes him today." The phrase hit Caleb harder than he expected. He'd seen animals go to slaughter before. It was part of the agricultural reality, but there was something about this particular horse that made the thought sit wrong in his gut. Maybe it was the way the animal held himself despite obvious neglect, or maybe Caleb just recognized something of himself in a creature that had been passed over and forgotten. "How much do they want for him?" Caleb heard himself ask. "Started at $100 this morning. Couldn't get a bite. They'll probably let him go for 75, maybe less." Ezra gave Caleb a concerned look. "You ain't thinking of buying him, are you?" "Caleb, you got enough troubles without taking on a half-dead horse." but Caleb was already calculating in his head. $75. It was money he didn't have to spare, money that should go toward the mortgage or the propane bill that was overdue. But it was also less than a tank of diesel, less than a trip to the hardware store, less than dinner for two at even a modest restaurant. And the horse needed someone. "I got a pasture he could recover in," Caleb said quietly. "Plenty of grass, clean water, wouldn't cost me much to feed him once he's back on weight." "And then what?" Ezra asked practically. "You going to sell him? A horse with no papers, no history, in that condition? You'd be lucky to get your $75 back, and that's if he survives the winter." Ezra was right, of course. It made no financial sense. But Caleb had learned over the past few hard years that life rarely made perfect financial sense, and sometimes you had to make decisions based on something other than the bottom line. Sometimes you had to do something just because it was the right thing to do, even if it was impractical, even if it cost you something you could barely afford to give. When the horse came up for auction 40 minutes later, Caleb was the only bidder. $75 sold. He paid in cash, 5 $20 bills and 3 5s that represented the last of his spending money until the small cattle sale check cleared next week. The auction house employee who processed the sale looked at him with undisguised pity. "You want his paperwork?" the woman asked, sliding a thin manila folder across the counter. "He's got papers?" Caleb was surprised. Registered horses usually sold for significantly more, even in poor condition. Just the health certificate from the Tennessee farm and a transfer document. No registration papers, if that's what you're thinking. Previous owner's name was Hazel Whitmore, died 4 months ago. That's about all we know. Caleb took the folder and went to collect his purchase. Loading the horse into his trailer, a 2-horse steel model that had seen better days, was surprisingly easy. The animal walked up the ramp without hesitation, despite his weakened condition, and stood quietly in the trailer stall as Caleb secured him. That calm cooperation, that intelligence in how the horse moved despite obvious neglect, reinforced Caleb's sense that this animal had been something special once. The drive back to Morrison Farm took 45 minutes through the winding back roads of central Kentucky. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made you remember why people called this state beautiful, despite all its economic struggles. The rolling hills were still green, though the trees were beginning to turn, splashes of orange and gold appearing among the remaining summer leaves. Tobacco barns stood sentinel on distant hillsides, and the air carried that particular autumn smell of dried grass and wood smoke. Caleb pulled into his farm just after 3 in the afternoon. The property looked tired in the afternoon light. The barn needed paint, the machine shed had a rusted roof, and the farmhouse itself showed its age, with sagging porch boards and windows that rattled in their frames. But the pastures were well maintained, the fences intact, and there was a small paddock near the barn that Caleb had been using for sick cattle that would work perfectly for the horse's recovery. Unloading took only a few minutes. The horse walked down the ramp carefully, his overgrown hooves clicking against the metal, and then stood perfectly still while Caleb closed up the trailer. Rex, the border collie, approached cautiously, sniffing at the newcomer with professional interest. The horse lowered his head slightly, allowing the dog to investigate, showing no aggression or fear. "Well," Caleb said aloud to both animals, "I guess you're home now." He led the horse to the small paddock, removed the worn halter the animal had come with, and watched as the gelding took his first tentative steps into what would be his new space. The horse walked to the center of the paddock, turned in a slow circle as if taking inventory of his surroundings, and then did something Caleb didn't expect. The horse walked to the fence line that faced east, toward the back portion of Caleb's property, where the land rose into a small wooded hillside, and simply stared. He stood perfectly motionless, his gaze fixed on that distant tree line, his entire body tense with what looked like anticipation or recognition. It was such a specific, intentional behavior that Caleb found himself following the horse's gaze, trying to see what the animal was looking at. But there was nothing there. Just pasture, fence line, and the woods beyond. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just the familiar landscape of a farm Caleb had known his entire life. "What are you looking at, buddy?" Caleb asked quietly. The horse didn't move, didn't acknowledge Caleb's presence. He just kept staring at that eastern tree line as the afternoon shadows lengthened and the October sun sank lower in the Kentucky sky. It was the first strange thing Caleb noticed about the $75 horse. It wouldn't be the last. The first week with the horse established a routine that was both encouraging and unsettling. Caleb named him Cedar after the trees that lined the eastern portion of his property, and threw himself into the animal's rehabilitation with the same stubborn determination he'd applied to keeping his failing farm afloat. Each morning before dawn, he'd walk out to the paddock with a flake of good Timothy hay and a bucket of senior feed mixed with supplements to help Cedar gain weight. The horse ate well, not with the desperate hunger of a starving animal, but with steady, methodical efficiency that suggested he'd simply been denied adequate food rather than abused or traumatized. By the end of that first week, Cedar had already put on noticeable weight. His coat began to show hints of the rich mahogany bay color it should have been, and his eyes had lost some of that hollow look. Caleb trimmed his hooves carefully, shocked to find that beneath the overgrowth and cracks, the hoof structure was excellent. The kind of solid bone and healthy frog you'd expect in a well-bred horse. He also called Claire Anderson, the local large animal veterinarian, to come out and give Cedar a thorough examination. Claire arrived on a Saturday morning in mid-October, driving her mobile vet truck up the gravel driveway with the professional efficiency of someone who'd been making farm calls for 15 years. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean with shoulder-length brown hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she had a reputation for being both skilled and straight-talking. She'd handled Caleb's cattle through several emergencies over the years, and she was one of the few people in the county who never made him feel like a failure for his farm's financial struggles. "So this is the mysterious horse everyone's talking about," Claire said, leaning against the paddock fence with her arms crossed, watching Cedar graze in the morning sunlight. "Ezra called me, said you'd lost your mind and bought a half-dead horse at auction." $75 seemed like a reasonable investment, Caleb replied with a slight smile. "In what universe?" But Claire was already walking into the paddock, her veterinary bag in hand, her movements calm and professional. Cedar lifted his head as she approached, but didn't move away, allowing her to run her hands over his body, checking his heart rate, his breathing, his muscle tone. She spent nearly 20 minutes examining him, taking notes on a small pad, occasionally making thoughtful sounds. "Well?" Caleb asked when she finally walked back to the fence. "Honestly, this horse is in better condition than I expected. Malnourished, yes, and he's been neglected for several months, but there's no sign of abuse or serious health issues. His teeth need floating, which I can do next week, and he could use a full deworming protocol. But structurally, Caleb, this is a well-built horse. Look at his shoulder angulation, his hip structure. This isn't some backyard-grade horse. Somebody put money into breeding him, and he's been trained. You can see it in how he moves, how he responds to handling. The auction paperwork said he came from a farm in Tennessee. Woman named Hazel Whitmore owned him." Claire frowned thoughtfully. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Did they have any registration papers?" "No papers. Just a health certificate and transfer form. Might be worth doing some digging. A horse of this quality doesn't just end up at a kill-buyer auction without a story behind it." Claire closed her bag and looked at Caleb seriously. "Speaking of stories, Have you noticed anything odd about his behavior? The question caught Caleb off guard. What do you mean? Ezra mentioned you said the horse seems fixated on something, that he stands at the fence staring at your back property. Caleb felt a small chill despite the warm October sun. He hadn't told Ezra about Cedar's strange behavior, at least he didn't think he had. But in a rural community like theirs, word traveled fast, and maybe Ezra had driven by and seen it himself. Yeah, Caleb admitted. Every evening around dusk, he goes to the eastern fence line and just stares. Stands there for hours sometimes, completely focused on the woods. I've walked back there a dozen times trying to figure out what he's looking at, but there's nothing, just trees and old pasture. Claire was quiet for a moment, watching Cedar, who was indeed drifting toward that eastern fence line, even as they spoke. Animals have better senses than we do, she said finally. Could be he smells something, hears something we can't perceive. Might be wildlife in those woods, deer, coyotes, or... She paused. Or what? Or he's remembering something. Horses have excellent memories, especially for places and routines. If he lived around here before, if something significant happened in that direction, he might be responding to that memory. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't quite fit what Caleb was observing. This wasn't casual interest or the normal awareness an animal might have of its surroundings. This was focused, intentional, almost urgent. Over the following 2 weeks, Cedar's physical recovery continued steadily. By the end of October, he'd gained 100 pounds easily, his coat had developed a healthy shine, and he moved with increasing energy and grace. But the strange behaviors multiplied rather than diminished. Cedar would not enter certain areas of the paddock. There was a section in the southwest corner, near an old metal feeding trough that Caleb hadn't used in years, that the horse actively avoided. He'd graze right up to within 10 feet of it, then veer away, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from going closer. When Caleb tried to lead him into that area, Cedar would plant his feet and refuse to move, not with the stubborn resistance of a bratty horse, but with something that looked more like genuine fear or distress. The nightly vigils continued and intensified. Every evening as the sun set, Cedar would position himself at the eastern fence, facing the woods, and stand motionless until full dark. Sometimes Caleb would sit on his porch with a beer, watching the horse silhouette against the twilight sky, and feel an inexplicable sense of unease. There was something about the animal's behavior that suggested purpose, expectation, as if Cedar was waiting for something or someone. Then there were the cicatrices, the scars. As Cedar's coat improved and Caleb groomed him more carefully, he began to notice marking patterns on the horse's body that he'd initially missed. On Cedar's left shoulder, mostly hidden beneath the hair, was a series of old scars forming what looked almost like letters or numbers. They'd healed years ago and were only visible when Caleb brushed the hair in a certain direction against the coat growth. He photographed them with his phone, trying to make sense of the pattern, but it was too degraded to read clearly. There was also a small, precise scar behind Cedar's left ear, the kind that might have been made by a microchip injection, though when Caleb borrowed a chip reader from Claire and scanned the area, nothing registered. Whatever had been there, if anything, was long gone. One evening in early November, with winter's early darkness falling at 5:30 and a cold wind blowing down from the north, Caleb decided to follow Cedar's gaze more systematically. He waited until the horse took his usual position at the fence, then grabbed a flashlight and walked out across the back pasture toward the woods. Rex followed at his heels, the border collie's presence reassuring in the gathering dark. The back portion of Caleb's property was land he rarely used anymore, too far from the barn for convenient cattle grazing, too rough for equipment. The pasture gave way to a mixed hardwood forest of oak, hickory, and maple that covered the hillside rising behind his farm. He'd played in these woods as a child, knew most of the deer trails and old fence lines that crisscrossed the property, but he hadn't walked them extensively in years. As Caleb entered the tree line, Rex suddenly stopped. His ears perked forward, a low whine emerging from his throat. The dog's behavior made Caleb pause, sweeping his flashlight through the darkening woods. The beam caught nothing but trees, fallen leaves, the normal chaos of a Kentucky forest in autumn. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked quietly. Rex whined again but didn't move forward. The dog, normally fearless around wildlife and always eager to investigate, seemed reluctant to proceed deeper into the woods. After a moment, Caleb decided not to push it. Whatever was out there, if anything, could wait for daylight. But as he turned to head back to the house, his flashlight beam swept across something that made him stop. There, about 30 yards into the woods, barely visible among the trees, was what looked like an old structure. Caleb walked closer, Rex following reluctantly, until his light revealed a half-collapsed storage shed, ancient and overgrown with vines that he'd completely forgotten existed. His grandfather had built it decades ago, back when the farm was larger and more prosperous, as a storage space for equipment and supplies used in the back pastures. Caleb hadn't thought about the old shed in years. It had been abandoned long before he'd taken over the farm, left to slowly rot back into the forest floor. But standing there in the November darkness, watching Cedar's silhouette still visible at the fence line behind him, Caleb wondered if this old shed was what the horse had been staring at all along. And if so, why? What could possibly connect a horse from Tennessee to a forgotten structure on a Kentucky farm? The questions followed him back to the house and kept him awake long into the night, listening to the November wind rattle his windows and wondering what secrets $75 had bought him, along with one mysterious horse. November brought cold rain and early darkness to Kentucky, the kind of weather that settled into your bones and made even routine farm work feel like an endurance test. Caleb's morning chores took longer in the dark and cold, and money remained tight. The November mortgage payment had gone through, but December was already looming, and he'd had to sell 3 cows to cover a propane bill that couldn't wait any longer. But Cedar continued to improve, transforming from the neglected animal he'd been into something remarkable. By mid-November, the horse had filled out substantially, his coat gleaming even in the grey light, his movements powerful and precise. More than once, watching Cedar move across the paddock, Caleb found himself wondering about the horse's history. This was no ordinary farm horse. The way Cedar carried himself, the obvious training evident in how he responded to basic commands, suggested someone had invested significant time and money into him. The question of the old shed wouldn't leave Caleb alone. On a Saturday morning, when the rain finally broke and weak sunshine filtered through the clouds, he decided to investigate the structure more thoroughly. He packed a thermos of coffee, grabbed better tools than just a flashlight, and headed into the woods, with Rex trailing behind. In daylight, the old shed looked even more decrepit than it had at night. The roof had partially collapsed. Vines and small trees grew through the broken walls, and decades of leaf litter covered the floor. But the structure's foundation was still solid, poured concrete that his grandfather had laid in the 1960s, built to last. Caleb circled the building, noting how the walls had fallen away on 3 sides, but the back wall, built against the hillside, remained relatively intact. He was about to leave, satisfied that there was nothing here but old wood and memories, when Rex began digging at the base of that back wall. The dog scratched at the leaf litter with intense focus, whining and looking back at Caleb as if urging him to pay attention. "What'd you find, boy?" Caleb knelt beside the dog, pushing away leaves and debris. His hand struck something solid beneath the forest detritus, not wood or concrete, but metal. He dug more urgently now, clearing away years of accumulated leaves and dirt, until he'd exposed what appeared to be a metal box about 2 feet square, buried flush with the concrete foundation. The box was locked, secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted significantly but still held. Caleb's heart pounded as he worked the lock free with a pry bar, the metal finally giving way with a screech of corroding hinges. Inside the box, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic sheeting that had protected it from moisture, was a leather saddlebag. Caleb carried the saddlebag back to his house, his mind racing with possibilities. On his kitchen table, under the bare bulb overhead, he carefully unwrapped the plastic and opened the leather bag. Inside, he found a bundle of cash, $8,400 in older bills, mostly 50s and 100s, wrapped in rubber bands that had deteriorated to sticky fragments. A small notebook filled with handwritten entries, dates and numbers that looked like financial records or transaction logs. Several photographs, faded but still clear, showing a beautiful bay horse, unmistakably cedar, though younger and in peak condition, with a small, elderly woman who wore riding clothes and smiled at the camera with fierce pride. And a letter, written in careful cursive on yellowed paper, addressed to whoever finds this. Caleb's hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter and began to read. My name is Hazel Whitmore, and if you're reading this, I'm either dead or the Alzheimer's has taken me to a place where I can't remember my own name. Either way, I need to tell the truth about what happened, and I need someone to take care of my boy, Justice. That's his real name, Justified Decision. I called him Justice for short. He was the best horse I ever owned, the smartest, the bravest. I bought him as a 3-year-old in 2015, and I trained him myself. He could have been something special. We were heading toward regional reining competitions, maybe even nationals. But then, my life fell apart. My husband died in 2019. We'd been married for 47 years, and suddenly I was alone on our farm in Tennessee, with nothing but memories and animals. I tried to keep going, but the money ran out. Medical bills from his cancer treatment, then the farm debt, then my own diagnosis. Early onset Alzheimer's at 64 years old. I knew I was losing my mind. I knew I'd forget things, important things, so I made arrangements. I had family, cousins mostly, who said they'd help. They said they'd take care of my animals when I couldn't anymore. They said they'd find good homes for my horses. They lied. I started forgetting things in 2021. Days would just disappear. I'd find myself standing in the barn not knowing how I got there. But I had moments of clarity too, and in one of those moments I saw what my cousins were really doing. They weren't finding homes for my horses. They were selling them cheap, sometimes to meat buyers, just to get them off the property fast so they could liquidate the farm and take what little money was left. Justice was special. He deserved better. So during one of my clear days, I took him and I ran. I had a friend. I think I remember his name was Caleb Morrison, a young farmer I'd met at an agricultural conference years ago in Kentucky, who'd told me if I ever needed help with a horse, he had land. I found Morrison Farm on a map. It took me 2 days of driving with Justice in my trailer, stopping whenever I got confused, but I made it. I was too afraid to knock on the door. I didn't know if I was remembering right, if this was even the right place. If this Caleb would remember me. The Alzheimer's made everything uncertain, so I did something crazy. I hid Justice in the woods at the edge of what I thought was Morrison Farm, left him with water and feed, and I buried everything important in this box near an old shed I found. Then I forgot. I forgot where I was, forgot where I'd left Justice, forgot why I was in Kentucky. Someone found me wandering on the highway 3 days later and took me to a hospital. By the time my cousins came to get me, I couldn't remember any of it. Justice was gone, lost somewhere in Kentucky, and I couldn't tell anyone where because I couldn't remember. The money in this box is all I had left. It's for Justice's care, for whoever finds him and gives him a good home. The notebook has his medical records, his training history, everything someone would need to know about him. If you're reading this, please take care of my boy. He deserved better than what life gave him. He deserves someone who'll appreciate what a special horse he is. Hazel Whitmore, written March 2022. Caleb sat at his kitchen table for a long time after reading the letter, the implications washing over him in waves. Hazel Whitmore had known his name, had remembered him from a conference he now vaguely recalled attending years ago, one of those agricultural workshops where he'd talked to dozens of farmers about sustainable practices and land management. She'd brought Justice here deliberately, trying to save her horse from her family's greed, but the Alzheimer's had stolen her memory before she could complete her mission. And Cedar, Justice, had somehow survived in those woods alone for days, maybe longer, before someone found him wandering, and he ended up in the system that would eventually lead him to that auction where Caleb bought him back for $75, never knowing the horse had been meant for him all along. The strange behaviors suddenly made perfect sense. Justice staring at the woods wasn't random. He was looking at the place where Hazel had left him, where he'd waited for her to return. The areas he avoided in the paddock might be places where he'd had negative experiences during his time lost and confused. The scars, the signs of training, the intelligence, all of it added up to a horse with a history far more complex than Caleb had imagined. He spent the rest of the day reading through Hazel's notebook. The entries detailed Justice's training, his competition results, his personality quirks. Hazel had loved this horse deeply, had poured her knowledge and passion into making him exceptional. And according to the records, Justice, Justified Decision, was a registered American quarter horse with bloodlines that included some of the best reining horse genetics in the country. In peak condition, with proper training, he could have been worth $30,000 or $40,000. But more than the monetary value, Caleb understood something else. He'd been given a responsibility. Hazel Whitmore had trusted him, even in the confusion of her deteriorating mind, to give Justice the life he deserved. And somehow, through circumstance and chance, or maybe fate, the horse had found his way back to the farm he'd been meant for all along. That evening, as the November sun set and Justice took his usual position at the fence, Caleb walked out to the paddock with Hazel's letter in his hand. He stood beside the horse, watching the woods together. "She tried, buddy," Caleb said quietly. "She tried to save you, and she almost made it. She would want you to know that." Justice turned his head slightly, acknowledging Caleb's presence, and for the first time since arriving on the farm, the horse seemed to relax. The rigid tension that had characterized his evening vigils eased, and after a few minutes he turned away from the fence and walked back toward the center of the paddock. It was as if, somehow, the horse understood that his story had finally been told. His purpose understood. Hazel Whitmore was gone, lost to the disease that had stolen her memories and ultimately her life. But her final gift, the horse she'd loved and the trust she'd placed in a stranger, had survived. Now Caleb just had to figure out what to do with that gift and how $8,400 in cash, buried in a box, might change everything about his struggling farm's future. The discovery of the cash and Justice's true identity created a crisis of conscience that kept Caleb awake for the better part of 3 nights. $8,400 was more money than he'd seen in one place in years. It could pay 2 months of mortgage, could fix the truck's check engine light problem, could stock up on feed for the winter, could address a dozen urgent needs that he'd been putting off because there was simply no money available. But the money wasn't really his. It belonged to Hazel Whitmore, or more accurately, to her estate. The ethical thing to do would be to contact her family, explain what he'd found, return the money to them, and probably hand over Justice as well. That was the right thing, the legal thing, the thing that wouldn't result in any complications or potential accusations of theft. The problem was Hazel's letter. She'd explicitly wanted Justice away from her family, had called them liars, had hidden her horse and her money specifically to keep both safe from relatives who'd been more interested in liquidating assets than respecting her wishes. If Caleb contacted them now, would they even let him keep Justice? Or would they take the valuable horse, sell him to whoever offered the highest bid, and pocket the money without any consideration for what Hazel had actually wanted? On the third sleepless night, Caleb made a decision. He would keep the money, but he wouldn't spend it on himself. Every dollar would go into Justice's care, into transforming the horse back into what he could have been, into honoring Hazel's final wishes. And he would find a way to establish legal ownership of Justice so that no one could take the horse away and undo what Hazel had tried so hard to accomplish. The next morning, he called Claire Anderson and asked if she could recommend an equine attorney. She gave him a name, a lawyer in Lexington who specialized in horse ownership disputes and registration issues. The consultation cost Caleb $250 he couldn't afford, but by the end of the call, he had a plan. The legal situation was complex, but not impossible. Justice had passed through several ownership transfers since Hazel's family had liquidated her farm, and Caleb had a legitimate bill of sale from the auction. The lawyer explained that if Caleb could prove he'd purchased the horse in good faith and had invested in the animal's care, and if no one came forward with a prior claim within a certain time frame, he could establish legal ownership. The registration paperwork would be trickier. Justice's papers had been lost in the chaos of Hazel's estate, but with the veterinary records and training history from Hazel's notebook, they could potentially apply for registration reinstatement. The key, the lawyer explained, is documentation. Keep records of everything you spend on this horse. Every vet visit, every bag of feed, every training session. Build a paper trail that shows you've acted in the horse's best interest. Caleb started documenting immediately. He photographed Justice from every angle, recording his condition and progress. He had Claire come out for a full veterinary workup, paying for it with Hazel's money and keeping every receipt. He began training sessions, working with Justice on basic ground manners and evaluating what the horse remembered from his reining training. What he discovered astonished him. Despite months of neglect and the trauma of being lost and confused in the Kentucky woods, Justice remembered his training perfectly. When Caleb set up simple ground poles and asked for precision movement, Justice executed commands with a sharpness that took Caleb's breath away. The horse could pivot on his hindquarters with collection and power, could move laterally with barely a cue, could transition from walk to trot to canter with seamless precision. This wasn't just a well-trained horse. This was an athlete, a competitor, an animal with natural talent that had been refined by expert handling. In the right hands, with the right training program, Justice could compete at high levels. He had the movement, the intelligence, and the heart. But there was a problem. Caleb wasn't a reining trainer. He was a cattle farmer who'd grown up riding workhorses and fixing fences. He knew enough about horses to recognize talent when he saw it, but developing that talent to its full potential required expertise he simply didn't have. That's when he thought of Nora Brennan. Nora was a professional horse trainer who operated a small facility about 30 miles north near Frankfurt. Caleb had met her years ago through agricultural circles. She sometimes gave clinics on natural horsemanship and had a reputation for being able to work with difficult horses. She was in her early 50s, a compact woman with iron-gray hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of working with large animals. She'd grown up in Montana, trained with some of the best Western trainers in the country, and had moved to Kentucky 15 years ago to be closer to family. Caleb called her on a Saturday morning in late November, explained the situation, most of it anyway, and asked if she'd be willing to evaluate Justice. A $75 auction horse who might have been a reigning prospect? Nora's voice was skeptical, but interested. "Caleb, that sounds like either a miracle or a delusion." "Come see for yourself," Caleb said. "If I'm wrong, I'll admit it. But if I'm right—" "If you're right, we might have something worth working with," Nora finished. "I'll be there Tuesday afternoon." Nora arrived at Morrison Farm on a cold, clear Tuesday afternoon, with temperatures in the low 40s and a brisk north wind that cut through coats and made the horse's breath steam in the air. She drove a well-maintained pickup with a small horse trailer behind it, and she walked with the bow-legged gait of someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than on the ground. Caleb brought Justice out into the round pen he'd spent the weekend repairing. The horse looked magnificent, his coat gleaming in the winter sunlight, his body filled out and muscled, his movements powerful and precise. Nora stood at the rail for a long time, just watching Justice move, her experienced eyes evaluating every aspect of the horse's conformation and movement. "Walk him toward me," she said finally. Caleb led Justice forward. Nora crouched down, examining the horse's legs, his hooves, running her hands over joints and tendons with professional thoroughness. Then she had Caleb move the horse through a series of exercises, backing up, turning, side-passing, executing various gaits. After 40 minutes of evaluation, Nora finally spoke. "Where the hell did this horse really come from?" Caleb made a decision then to trust her with the full story. He showed her Hazel's letter, the notebook with Justice's training records, the documentation he'd been building. He explained everything: the lost woman with Alzheimer's, the desperate attempt to save a beloved horse, the money buried in a box in the woods. Nora read the letter twice, then looked at Justice with something approaching reverence. "Justified decision," she said quietly. "I knew that name. Hazel Whitmore. Jesus, Caleb. She was training with Tom McCutcheon's people back in the day. She was good, really good, before her life fell apart. And this horse," she gestured to Justice. "This horse has genetics that most trainers would kill for. His sire was Wimpy's little step. His dam was a smart Shikalena granddaughter. That's serious reigning bloodlines." "Can he be what he was supposed to be?" Caleb asked. "Can we finish what Hazel started?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, watching Justice. "Maybe," she said finally, "but it won't be easy. He's 9 years old, which means he's past the typical age for starting a serious competition career. He's been through trauma, the neglect, the time lost in the woods, the confusion. And reining at a high level requires consistent training, money for entries and travel, time that I'm not sure either of us has. But it's possible? It's possible." Nora turned to face Caleb directly. "But why? Why invest this kind of time and effort into a horse when you can barely keep your farm afloat? You could sell him now, with his bloodlines documented, probably get $5,000 or $6,000. That would help your financial situation a lot more than trying to campaign him in competitions." It was the practical question, the one Caleb had been asking himself for weeks. But standing there in the cold November afternoon, watching Justice move with such natural grace and power, he knew the answer. "Because Hazel Whitmore trusted me to give him a chance," Caleb said simply. "She could have sold him, could have done a dozen other things, but she chose to believe that somewhere in Kentucky there was a man who'd care enough to do right by her horse. I can't bring her back, can't fix what Alzheimer's stole from her, but I can do this. I can finish what she started." Nora smiled, a small but genuine expression of respect. "All right then," she said. "Let's make a plan." They spent the next 2 hours discussing possibilities. Nora proposed a partnership. She'd provide the training expertise, use Justice in some of her clinics to give him experience and exposure, and work toward getting him ready for regional reining competitions in the spring. Caleb would cover the basic care costs using Hazel's money, handle the farm-side logistics, and continue Justice's conditioning work on the days when Nora wasn't training. It wasn't a certain path to success. Justice would be competing against horses that had been in training programs since they were 3 years old, riders who'd invested tens of thousands of dollars in their mounts, trainers who made their living producing winning horses. But it was a chance, a shot at honoring Hazel's vision, at proving that a $75 auction horse could be something more than forgotten potential. As Nora was leaving, she turned back to Caleb one more time. "You know this is crazy, right? You're broke, your farm is struggling, and you're about to sink time and money into a horse with no guarantee of any return." "Yeah," Caleb agreed, "but sometimes crazy is the only option that makes sense." That night, with the first real winter cold settling over Kentucky and the stars bright in the clear December sky, Caleb sat on his porch with Rex at his feet and watched Justice move through the paddock. The horse no longer stood at the fence staring at the woods. Instead, he moved with purpose and confidence, his body language transformed from the tense, waiting posture he'd held for weeks into something more relaxed and present. Hazel Whitmore was gone, her mind stolen by disease, her final wishes nearly lost to time and circumstance, but her gift survived. Her horse, her trust, her hope that somewhere in the world there were still people who cared enough to do the hard right thing instead of the easy wrong thing. Caleb couldn't save his farm, couldn't change his financial situation overnight, couldn't bring back the life he'd lost when his wife left and the agricultural economy collapsed. But he could do this one thing. He could take a $75 horse and prove that value wasn't measured in price tags and that sometimes the best investments were the ones that made no financial sense at all. Winter settled hard over Kentucky that year, bringing ice storms in January and bitter cold that tested both man and animal. Caleb's propane bills climbed, his truck finally died completely and had to be replaced with an even older model, bought from a neighbor for $800, and the February mortgage payment was only possible because he sold his last remaining piece of good equipment, a hay baler he'd been hoping to keep. But through it all, Justice thrived. Nora came twice a week without fail, working the horse through increasingly complex exercises, building muscle and precision and confidence. Justice remembered more of his training each session, skills that had been buried under months of trauma and neglect, surfacing like forgotten memories. His reining patterns became sharper, his stops more dramatic, his spins tighter and more controlled. Caleb watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Every dollar from Hazel's buried cash went into Justice's training and care, $22,400 for Nora's training fees, $800 for specialized tack and equipment, $600 for veterinary care and farrier work, $200 for high-quality feed and supplements. By March, the money was nearly gone, but Justice looked like a completely different horse than the neglected animal Caleb had bought at auction 5 months earlier. The real test came in early April, when Nora entered Justice in his first competition, a small local reining show in Frankfurt. Nothing fancy, but a chance to see how the horse would handle the pressure of an actual competition environment. Caleb used the last of Hazel's money to pay the entry fees and hauling costs, aware that if Justice didn't perform well, there would be no money for future competitions. The morning of the show dawned cold and overcast, with temperatures in the low 50s and threatening rain. Caleb loaded Justice into the borrowed trailer he'd arranged with Ezra, who'd agreed to come along for moral support and to handle some of the logistics. Nora met them at the showgrounds, a regional agricultural center with indoor and outdoor arenas and facilities that, to Caleb, looked impossibly professional and expensive. Justice loaded and traveled well, showing none of the anxiety or stress that many horses exhibited in new environments. When they unloaded him at the showgrounds, he looked around with interest but not fear, his ears forward, his body language confident. Watching him, Caleb felt a surge of gratitude toward Hazel Whitmore, wherever her spirit might be. She'd done this, had built this foundation of confidence and training that allowed Justice to handle new situations with grace. The competition didn't start until afternoon, so Caleb walked the grounds, watching other horses and riders warm up. The level of skill and investment was immediately obvious. These were serious competitors with expensive tack, professional trainers, horses that represented years of specialized breeding and training. Justice, with his auction house origins and interrupted training, seemed like an impossible underdog. Nora must have sensed Caleb's doubt because she pulled him aside before the warm-up. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "Justice has something most of these horses don't. Heart. He's been through hell and come out the other side, and that creates a kind of resilience that you can't buy or breed for. Don't count him out." The reining pattern they'd drawn was pattern number 7, a standard NRHA pattern that included large fast circles, small slow circles, flying lead changes, rollbacks, spins, and a sliding stop. It was a test of precision, control, and athletic ability that would showcase everything Justice had relearned over the past months. Caleb stood at the rail with Ezra and Claire, who'd closed her veterinary practice for the afternoon to come watch. His hands were shaking slightly as Nora and Justice entered the arena, the pair looking tiny in the large indoor space with its carefully groomed footing and professional lighting. The announcer called their names, and the pattern began. What happened over the next 3.5 minutes was something Caleb would remember for the rest of his life. Justice moved through the pattern with a precision and power that silenced the casual conversations around the arena. His circles were round and correct, his lead changes clean, his spins tight and fast, with the horse's pivot foot planted perfectly. And his sliding stop, the signature move of reining where the horse runs full speed and then slides to a halt with his hind legs, was spectacular, leaving a 30-foot track in the arena footing that drew audible gasps from the crowd. Nora rode with quiet confidence, her cues invisible to observers, letting Justice showcase his natural talent. And the horse, this animal that had been hours from a slaughter truck just 5 months ago, performed like he'd been born for this exact moment. When the pattern ended and Nora trotted Justice out of the arena, the applause was genuine and sustained. Caleb found his eyes wet with tears he hadn't expected, overcome by the sight of this horse, Hazel's horse, his horse, proving that redemption was possible, that written-off lives could still matter, that $75 horses could be worth everything. Justice didn't win the competition. He placed 3rd in his class, a solid showing, but not spectacular, given the high level of the other competitors. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd competed, had proven he belonged in that arena, had shown that Hazel Whitmore's faith in him had been justified. After the competition, as Caleb was loading Justice back into the trailer, a man approached him. He was in his 60s, well-dressed in expensive Western wear, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life around horses. "That's justified decision, isn't it?" the man said, gesturing to Justice. "I'd recognize his movement anywhere. I knew Hazel Whitmore, watched her train that horse when he was young. I heard she died and everything got sold off. How in the world did you end up with him?" Caleb told the story, an abbreviated version, but hitting the important points. Hazel's Alzheimer's, her desperate attempt to save her horse, the buried money and letter, the auction, the slow piecing together of the truth. The man listened intently, and when Caleb finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Hazel was a hell of a horsewoman," he said finally, "one of the best I ever knew. She would be proud of what you're doing, proud that her horse ended up with someone who cares enough to finish what she started." He handed Caleb a business card. "I'm a reining judge and trainer. If you ever need advice, recommendations, help navigating the competition world, call me. What you're doing matters, not just for the horse, but for everyone who ever wondered if doing the right thing actually means anything in this world." The drive back to Morrison Farm took over an hour through the Kentucky twilight. Justice riding quietly in the trailer behind them. Ezra drove, letting Caleb process everything that had happened, and it wasn't until they were pulling into the farm driveway that the older man finally spoke. "You know what's going to happen now, don't you?" Ezra said. "Word's going to get around. People are going to hear about the auction horse that's competing in reining. You're going to get offers to buy him, serious offers, the kind of money that could save your farm." Caleb had already thought about this. Justice, with his documented bloodlines and proven ability, was now worth far more than the $75 Caleb had paid. With the right marketing, the compelling story, the growing reputation, he could probably sell Justice for $20,000, maybe more. That money could pay off the mortgage for almost a year, could fix everything that was broken on the farm, could give Caleb breathing room he hadn't had in half a decade. "I'm not selling him," Caleb said quietly. "I didn't figure you would," Ezra replied with a slight smile. "Just wanted to make sure you'd thought it through. Hazel didn't hide that money and write that letter so I could sell her horse for profit. She wanted him to have a chance at the life he deserved. That's not about money. It's about honoring a promise." They unloaded Justice in silence, the horse walking calmly back to his paddock, where fresh hay and water waited. As Caleb removed the halter and watched Justice move away into the dusk, he realized something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't about saving a horse anymore, or honoring a dead woman's wishes, or even about competition results. This was about proving to himself that there were things in life more valuable than money, more important than financial stability, more essential than the practical calculations that usually govern decision-making. This was about standing for something, about being the kind of person who did the hard right thing even when the easy wrong thing would solve immediate problems. His farm was still struggling. The mortgage was still impossible. The equipment was still breaking down. Nothing practical had changed, but everything essential had transformed. Over the following months, Justice continued to compete. Not every show went well. There were low scores, tough judges, moments where the old trauma surfaced and affected performance. But there were also victories. Moments of brilliance, growing recognition in the Kentucky reining community that Morrison Farm's unlikely horse was something special. More importantly, the story spread, not just among horse people, but beyond. Local newspapers picked it up. Farmer honors Alzheimer's victims' final wish. Then regional media, and eventually a few national equestrian publications. People started visiting Morrison Farm, wanting to see Justice, wanting to hear the story directly from Caleb. And something unexpected happened. The attention brought opportunities. A feed company offered to sponsor Justice's competition costs in exchange for using his story in their marketing. A local agricultural non-profit asked Caleb to speak at their conference about ethical animal ownership and honoring commitments. 3 other farmers who were struggling financially reached out to Caleb for advice, and he found himself becoming an informal mentor, helping others navigate the impossible balance between doing right and staying afloat. By the time winter approached again, a full year after Caleb had bought Justice at auction, Morrison Farm was still poor, still struggling, still operating on borrowed time and borrowed money. The mortgage remained a monthly crisis. The equipment still broke down. The cattle herd was smaller than it should be. But Caleb wasn't alone anymore. The network of people who'd been touched by Justice's story, by Hazel's final gift, by the reminder that kindness and commitment still mattered, had created a community. People helped each other, shared resources, supported one another through the hard times. The farm was still failing by traditional economic measures, but it was succeeding in ways that mattered more, as a testament to the idea that some things were worth preserving even when they didn't make financial sense. On a cold December evening, exactly 1 year after finding Hazel's letter, Caleb stood in his paddock with Justice, watching the sunset paint the Kentucky hills in shades of orange and gold. The horse stood quietly beside him, no longer staring at the woods, no longer waiting for someone who would never return. "She saved you, you know," Caleb said quietly to the horse. "But I think maybe you saved me too. Reminded me what matters, why we do this impossible work of trying to make a living from the land." Justice turned his head slightly, his dark, intelligent eyes reflecting the sunset, and in that moment Caleb could almost imagine Hazel Whitmore standing there with them, the woman whose deteriorating mind had still held enough love and determination to save one horse, to trust one stranger, to believe that somewhere in the world there were still people who do the right thing. The $75 horse had been worth every penny and more, not because of what he could do in a competition arena or what he might sell for, but because of what he represented. Proof that value wasn't measured in dollars, that love and commitment could survive even the cruelest diseases, that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to try. Caleb's farm would probably fail eventually. The economics were too brutal, the debt too deep, the agricultural system too weighted against small operators like him. But he'd fought the good fight, had honored a promise he'd never explicitly made, had finished what a dying woman had started. And in the end, that $75 investment had bought something no amount of money could purchase. The certainty that he'd lived according to his values, that he'd stood for something that mattered, that when the story of his life was told, there would be at least one chapter worth remembering. Justice nickered softly and walked back toward the barn, his movements confident and purposeful. Caleb followed, ready to do the evening feeding, ready to face another mortgage payment he probably couldn't make, ready to continue the impossible work of keeping faith with the land and the animals that depended on him. The mystery of the $75 horse had been solved. The secret buried in the woods had been uncovered. And the life of one struggling farmer had been transformed, not by wealth or success, but by the simple act of keeping a promise to a woman he'd barely known and a horse that had been left behind by everyone except those who mattered most.